Have you ever wondered about the significance of Jesus' final words on the cross? My God, why have you forsaken me? Might seem puzzling, especially if Jesus is divine. But what if these words hold a deeper meaning, rooted in ancient Jewish tradition? In this video, we'll explore how these profound words connect to Psalm 22, a passage that foretells suffering, redemption, and a prophecy fulfilled in the most unexpected way. If Jesus was truly condemned to die for claiming to be God, how do we explain his final words on the cross? In Mark 15 verse 34, we read, "At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, my God, why have you forsaken me?" At first glance, this seems rather strange. How could Jesus, if he is divine, cry out to God, asking why he has been forsaken? Christians have attempted to reconcile this with the doctrine of the incarnation in various ways, which are beyond the scope of this video. But what I want to argue here is that this statement made by Jesus makes a lot of sense in light of the Jewish context. Any first-century Jew would recognize that Jesus was quoting the 22nd Psalm, which begins with, my God, why have you forsaken me?" It was common in early Judaism to invoke an entire psalm by quoting its opening line. We even see this practice in the Mishnah. To understand why Jesus quoted the first line of Psalm 22, we need to read the entire psalm. Psalm 22 is a song of faith that God will save his suffering servant, despite the appearance that God has abandoned him. Right after the opening lines, the psalm says that Israel's fathers trusted in God and were saved. Verse 24 specifically affirms that God did not turn away from the psalmist's suffering. For he did not despise or abhor the affliction of the afflicted. He did not hide his face from me, but heard when I cried to him. Moreover, Psalm 22 is credited to King David, written 1,000 years before Christ. Yet the psalm doesn't quite fit the "David was having a rough day" interpretation. David never experienced some of the events described in the psalm. In fact, it sounds eerily like a crucifixion scene. It's not hard to see why Jesus would quote this as a prophecy of his death. Let's examine some of the passages. I am poured out like water. All my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted within me. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue clings to my jaws. You have brought me to the dust of death, for dogs have surrounded me. The congregation of the wicked has enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. They look and stare at me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Some counter-apologists claim that Christian translators twisted the verse about the piercing of hands and feet, but that's not entirely true. The Greek Septuagint, which predates Jesus, clearly states, "They have gouged my hands and my feet." At the very least, these lines describe someone whose feet and hands have been seriously injured. The passage also describes someone who is naked, exposed to public gaze, and mocked. Disjointed bones would definitely be a result of crucifixion, and the victim would also be exhausted and dehydrated. Being poured out like water suggests bleeding out. Each of these scenes recalls something that happened during Jesus' crucifixion. Psalm 22 verse 18 gets very specific when it speaks of soldiers casting lots over Jesus' clothing. Justinian's Digest records that the clothing and small valuables of prisoners were forfeited to the executioner and his assistants. John, a witness to the crucifixion, describes the event in vivid detail. When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his clothes and divided them into 4 parts, one for each soldier. They also took his tunic. The tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. So they said to one another, "Let's not tear it, but cast lots for it to see who will get it." For Roman soldiers, indifferent to the horror of crucifixion, divided Jesus' clothes in the fairest way they knew, a quaternion of executioners casting lots for his garment. This doesn't seem to fit with anything we know about King David. Some claim that this was invented to fit Psalm 22, but there's nothing miraculous about it. This particular verse wasn't considered messianic by the rabbis, and as I've argued in other videos, there are multiple reasons to believe the Gospels are reliable. Lastly, while Psalm 22 begins with David's experience of feeling abandoned by God, it ends with the conversion of the heathen nations and the coming of God's kingdom. Here's how the psalm concludes. All the ends of the earth shall remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations shall worship before him. For dominion belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nations. Now, let's think about the progression of this psalm. It starts with the persecution and execution of Israel's king, and ends with pagan nations miraculously converted to worship the God of Israel. This begins when a Roman centurion witnesses Jesus' death and calls him God's son. We read this in Mark 15 verse 39. Jesus' cry on the cross doesn't prove that he died as a failure, but that he viewed his death as the victory of the God of Israel. The God of the Jews is now worshipped by literally billions of Gentiles today. We must ask, when exactly did this start? The answer is simple, with the death of Jesus of Nazareth. How could this passage apply to King David? David died peacefully as an old man in the arms of Abishag the Shunammite. Even the 11th century Jewish commentator Rashi applied these sufferings to the Jews in exile. Rashi writes, "They, meaning the people of Israel, are destined to go into exile," and David recited his prayer for the future. Rashi seems to think that this psalm applies to something that hasn't happened yet. But it's clear from the passage that this psalm refers to an individual. The Jewish exile didn't lead to the conversion of pagan nations, and other rabbinic midrash applied this passage to a future messianic figure, referred to as Ephraim. Since this psalm applies neither to Israel in exile nor to King David, who else's deliverance from extreme suffering and death was worthy of being repeatedly recounted before Israel's assembly? Is there any other individual's deliverance from extreme suffering or death worthy of worldwide attention, to the point where nations turn to the God of Israel because of it? It seems clear that Psalm 22 can only be fulfilled by the death and resurrection of the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth, the perfectly righteous one.